but I'll try to at least keep myself awake. You all can find a nice little comfy position. Don't mind at all if you start snoring, we'll just nudge you a little. As Paul said, we will take a break, so when I do start to see heads going, especially after having a good Mexican fiesta and cookies, we all kind of want to go into that evening kind of lull mode. I know I'm usually in bed at 8 o'clock and kind of getting all ready for the next day, and I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank, first of all of you in the room for the work that you do with all of your clients. As Paul said, I have experience being in your shoes, and it was both the most rewarding and most frustrating job I think I had. I loved working with the clients that I had, but I tended to work with people that had that beginning, mid-stage Alzheimer's or dementia, and it was very tough to see families sort of go through that process and really not understand and the frustrations and the difficulty, and being the caregiver just those few hours a day with that individual provided such respite for the family members that were really taking care of that individual. So I definitely know the work that you go through. One little short story that always sort of tugged at my heart was the gentleman I worked with, he would keep asking, what's that thing that I have? And so to tell him that it's Alzheimer's disease, you know, that's why you're having problems with your memory is a little different. We've come a long way. Now we're able to use more validation techniques. When he thought he was in Florida, I could be there with him in Florida, even though we were just in Mendota Heights. So the idea that we have to reframe the way we work with some people. So today, I am very happy that we had beautiful weather. This is amazing. If you haven't looked at the news, don't. Unfortunately, we're dropping 40 degrees over the next 24 hours and more snow is coming, so God bless Minnesota. In fact, they on Facebook, the Star Tribune said, what one word would you use to describe today? And people were putting things like relief, spring, and I put tease. What horrible, you know. I want this weather to stay, So when I was asked to come up with sort of a title for what I'm going to talk about today, which actually is pretty high level, I'm going to be talking about the demographic shift and policy. I will try and keep you up, I promise. I decided to look at winning the lottery or facing the apocalypse, trends in aging Minnesota. And it's because it depends on really how you look at aging. We have a few things we need to work on as the baby boom generation ages, or we're going to be in a little bit of trouble. But we have a lot of great untapped resources in people who are retired. A lot of expertise, a lot of great work ethic and work value that they can provide back to Minnesota and be very productive members of our community. So hopefully you'll be able to think about as we go through this, wow, some of that sounds doom and gloom. Think of it also as opportunity. This is a great time in Minnesota. We have a budget surplus. My goodness, that's something we never thought we would ever hear about again if you don't follow state government. Over the last many years, we have been in the red, and according to Minnesota's state constitution, we cannot be in the red. So we have to come to zero during a biennium every 2 years. So you probably have heard lots of changes, cuts to programs, maybe some increases in fees. There were no tax increases, just fee increases. But we actually have a budget surplus now, so and a pretty substantial one compared to most states. So things are looking up a little bit. We got spring and we got a little bit of money. So we'll let the legislators hammer out what they're going to do with it. Some of it will be invested very wisely, and some of it will wonder what the heck were they thinking when they invested it. But that's how politics work. So today I'm going to talk about a few things. The first one is the demographic changes, just so we're all sort of on the same page. When you leave today, I hope that you will understand that Minnesota is changing and is changing forever. And from my opinion, it's changing for the good. But I obviously have a background in aging and have a little bit of work life left in me, so I need to ensure that I have job security. So aging is a great field to go into. I tell my friends who go into youth development all the time that your population's getting smaller, mine's just booming. So we'll talk a little bit about why that is, how that's going to impact us. We'll also touch a little bit on money, the economic changes, because that's what's keeping them busy both in St. Paul and in Washington, D.C. That just because our population is aging, that's a great thing, but there are implications to what we call the public coffers, or basically government's paycheck, which we write that paycheck through taxes. And when people age and people retire, some things change to that paycheck to the government. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of those changes. And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about how is this going to change society. So we'll talk a little bit about the numbers, a little bit about the money, and then, well, what does this mean for Minnesota? How are things going to change? And then what's being coined the new normal, which I do know is a television show, right? That was canceled. So, but the new normal for Minnesota, what is it going to look like going into the future? How are things going to progress over the next 20 and 30 years? I also will welcome any questions that you may have along the way. I'll stop. Sometimes I tend to speak quite rapidly. I do try and stop. One person told me at one time to breathe between every word. That was a little extreme. I try to breathe between sentences now, but I learned that you can put a lot of commas in sentences, so I don't have to breathe as often. So if I do pass out, I know we have some nurses down the hall, but we'll get through this. So if you do have questions, shout them out, raise your hand. We will take a break also to let me rest a little bit and think about what I'm going to talk about in the second half in about an hour, 45 minutes or an hour. All right. So, if you didn't know from my little introduction, the population is aging, Minnesota is aging. If we look actually at the number of older adults throughout the decades, this is really a stark uptick over the past recent years. In fact, the Minnesota State Demographer, has anyone heard him speak before? His name, the former State Demographer, his name is Tom Gillespie. Real nice guy. He's from the South. He still has a Southern accent. He'd been in Minnesota 30 years, since the 70s. And he had this phrase. He loved studying demography. And he loved studying demography because he had one constant. Every 365 days, we get 1 year older. And that's really important for demographics. That doesn't change, right? We get 1 year older every year. And we can project that out. So for the last 30 years, the former state demographer has been saying, we're going to age like you've never seen before. And finally, 30 years later, people are listening. We have a new state demographer, about 40 years younger than our former state demographer, but she uses the same language, and she understands that Minnesota is changing radically, and not just our numbers, but we as people. So I'll talk a bit about that. So let's look sort of over the years at demographic trends. I'm not a big chart person. I prefer words, but I know for presentations, charts look really, really nice. So I have a bunch of charts that we'll all look at together, and again, hopefully you'll be able to follow me through them. So this chart actually is looking at the number of people 65 plus that we've added each decade. So from in the 1970s, from 1970 to 1979, we added 70,600 people over the age of 65 in Minnesota. That's sort of when they turn 65, and we just put a little hash mark, okay? So a respectable number. What's that about the population of, what's Bloomington at? That's pretty big now, so a little less than the population of Bloomington, maybe, so. Every year in Minnesota. We went down in the 80s a little bit. Everyone remember the 80s? Not the best time. Definitely not a good time for fashion. Not a good time for much. But economy was not going so well in the 80s. Made some significant changes. We didn't add as many. 90s was a great time, right? We had lots of money. We were spending it like no tomorrow. Again, not as many added. Again, this is still added, so we're still increasing the number of 65 plus in these decades. We start moving into the 2000s, and we get a little bit of an uptick. 83,000 in the first 10 years of 2000 were added, pretty significant. We hit 2010, the current decade that we're in, and we're tripling that. We've now, over up to 2019, we'll actually add 270,000 people 65 plus to our population. And then in the 2020s, we'll be adding 351,000 people 65 plus. Pretty significant change. That's almost 10 times the number of 65 plus people we added in the 90s. You can kind of see that there's a change in the number of people of different age groups, and I'll show you a couple more charts that show that. And then we sort of see what looks like to be a crash in 2030, but realistically that crash isn't really a crash. We are still adding 100,000 people 65 plus into Minnesota's population. So as you can see, we're getting older. We're adding more older people to our population. This is a fun little chart. I'm going to let you watch it for a minute, then I'll start explaining it. Yes?
Could you really attribute that to the baby boom? I mean, it's specifically correlated to the rise, and as we get older,
yep.
when that boom is done, we should be getting fewer.
Nope, you'll see why. But yes, you peeked at the magical box that I have back here. But you'll see that while the baby boom generation is a significant portion of this, we actually flatten out. We stay old. We never go back to being a young society. In fact, the U.S. won't. In fact, most of the world won't. We will now always be a fairly flat population distribution compared to what in the past has been a curve. And we've had a younger population and a smaller, older population. So as this is ticking through, I'll explain what's happening. Across the bottom are age groups. So way to the left are the youngest, the little children, and way to the right are the oldest. Here in 1920, we have the 75 plus being the oldest. And every time the bars change, we're increasing 5 years, okay? So you're going through time and you're seeing how the population changes every 5 years. So when we get to, this is kind of interesting, we have our first appearance of a centenarian, someone who's over the age of 100 here, and notice this flattening. I'll talk about that in a minute when we get back to the 1900s. So here you can see we have a lot of kids. We have not very many old people in the early 1900s, 1930s, 1940s. We start to see this. What the heck is that? Well, that would be the baby boom generation, that little bulge there, and we'll follow them through the years here, 2000, 2005. But look at behind the baby boom generation. We actually aren't dropping the way people think we would normally drop. The baby boom was born and all of a sudden we have this bust, what often is referred to as the baby boom bust. There wasn't a baby boom bust. In fact, actually, there's more millennials now. They haven't ended the millennial generation. I'm ready for them to end that generation. Not literally, just the year. So we can start counting the next generation. But you'll see that we stay old. That continues to go throughout our history. That's very significant because we never go back to being sort of that more young society, which has lots of implications for us as a community. This is referred to by lots of things, and this is why I said, is this winning the lottery or, Armageddon? The state, which it was like fingers on the chalkboard. Everyone understand that metaphor, running your fingers down, it just grates on you? The state used to call this the silver tsunami. So silver tsunami, because evidently all old people have silver hair. I guess that's the genius of the state that came up with that. And then tsunami because of the wave. But think about tsunami. How many people want to run towards a tsunami? Or think of it as an opportunity. Yay, the silver tsunami's here. Woohoo, let's party. So they've tried to rephrase that. Another one they tried was pig in the python. That's even worse. So if you think about, think about how a python eats. It just sort of walks, so I guess it doesn't walk. It slithers up to slithers up to whatever's there. And then it unhinges its jaw and just eats it whole. And basically, if you look at the demographic charts, as the pig goes through, that's like the baby boom generation. So they called it the pig and the python. The other one they talk about is the age wave. These are all sort of negative connotations, but it does give you the idea of how demographic charts look. We've got this wave and blah, blah, blah. I try not to use them, but they still are pretty visual and helpful in really thinking through So another way we talk about this is as the demographic shift, right? So what exactly does that shift mean? It means something has changed. That's what a shift is. So this chart that I'm going to show you shows the number of individuals, younger adults, older adults, and those who are aged 5 to 17. So those would be the kids that are in kindergarten all the way through high school through 12th grade. When you look at sort of their changes over time, this first shift would be the 18 to the 24-year-olds. We've actually always had a small number of 18 to 24-year-olds, young adults in our population. It's always been kind of a small number as you go through. It's also a small number of years, so obviously there's going to be less of a number there. But we start to look at sort of the other populations. We're adding the 65 plus. So if you look back in the 80s, there actually were more people 18 to 24 than there were older people. And then we're going to add the little ones, the little kids from 5 to 17 with that darker line. They aren't very contrasted very well, but you can see the little kids here. And we've always had really a lot of young people in our society, and we still did really up until the 2000s that we're moving into. In fact, I'll direct your attention to this arrow here that's pointing to the year 2020, and that's the shift, 2020. And when I started my studies a few years ago, this was so far off in the distance, 20, 30 years in the distance. This will be interesting once we get to it. It's here. 2020 is just around the bend, right? So this is where we are going to have a shift where we will have more people over the age of 65 than will have children in elementary, middle, and high school put together. It's the first time that this has ever happened in our society. It's never happened before. It has happened in other societies around the U.S. that are aging much faster than us. Some societies still have a lot more younger people than older people. Take, for example, China. China has a lot of young people. However, over the last 40 years, China has had a very significant policy that is really causing catastrophe in their demographic shift, and that's the one-child policy. So for every adult, you only have one child. So while currently China is a young society, they are going to be aging much faster, exponentially faster than we're aging because of their one-child policy. Their replacement rate is very, very, very low. So this is not new. There are some places in the world where there are significantly more younger people. They tend to be in sub-Saharan Africa, some places in sort of Asia, the Middle East. But again, when you look at the number of older adults, you have to sort of look at the life expectancy, and the life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa is half the life expectancy of ours. So the definition of older adult or elder in those communities is very different from our sort of Western definition. So this is a huge shift. This is really going to change the way things are happening in our state into the future. So let's go into what's influencing the trend. Why are people getting older? Well, we talked about the first one, which is the aging of the baby boom generation. So the baby boom generation is considered generally people that were born between the years 1946 and 1964. So why are those years significant? Why would we draw the boundaries there? Well, 1946, you start looking at the end of the war, and what happens when gentlemen typically leave and go fight and come back to their wives or their girlfriends? I hope I don't have to draw a map or a chart for you to understand what happens. That would be what's known as the baby boom. That goes up to about 1964. What happened in the mid-60s is we have all of those initiatives, the War on Poverty and the Great Society, really a change in the generation. So that sort of signifies the end of the baby boom generation. So if anyone ever says baby boomers, it's generally people 1946 to 1964. There are no hard and fast rules for determining generations. The generation ahead of the boomers, anyone know what that's called? Silent. It's a perfect answer. You all knew it. It's the silent generation, who before the baby boomers are the loud. We call them the loud generation. Yeah, right. I say that the boomers are definitely destroying everything but giving you job security. So I gotta love them both ways. So I'm just waiting for all the boomers to retire so then the next generation can take over, which is my generation. Anyone know the name of my generation? X, Generation X, yes. And then the current generation of young people, I already gave it away. It's the millennials. Sometimes called Generation Y. Why, I have no idea. Because we were X, I guess. And I do feel a little slighted being Generation X because there are fewer of us than boomers or millennials. So people often forget about us. We're the forgotten. We're the, the kind of middle child syndrome. We've got the boomers and we've got the, we're actually more like our grandparents than we are like our parents. So hopefully the millennials won't be like our parents. They'd be like the boomers and we're starting all over crazy insanity. So, yes.
I'm sorry, Generation X is the one after
boomers.
Boomers.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yep, so starting up at the top, we have silent. Before the silent, actually, some people refer to it as the swing generation / silent. Then we have the boomers. Then we have Generation X. And Generation X is about 1965 to 1980. It's generally the cutoff for Generation X. And then the millennials start in 81 millennials. They're all interesting. There are actually studies about working with different generations, and I think in this room, I never like to give guesses about age or anything, but I can imagine we have representation from most, if not all, of the generations. And it's always interesting when you have that type of multi-generational workforce, because everyone brings their own strengths to the table, and millennials tend to really have this real attachment to technology and independence, and sort of the silent generation tends to be more personal. Those personal relationships are important. So to actually work through those in a work environment and still be, aren't you top mid-sized employer? This is the, 22nd time in a row that kudos. So that was the first part of the trend, is sort of the aging of the baby boom generation. Okay? So then next is not just the aging of the baby boom generation, but it's the significant increase in our life expectancy. It's pretty amazing. Over the last 100 years, we've nearly doubled our life expectancy from around 40 to almost 80. And women always have that step up in life expectancy numbers, but that gap is sort of slowly closing as more women enter the workforce and are experience that same kind of stressor that's attributed to, tends to be a man's shorter life expectancy. So don't go to work. You can, I guess is the theme. Maybe I should just increase my life expectancy by not working. So why are we increasing our life expectancy? Well, it's due in a large part really to two things. And it's really medical advances. That's probably not a surprise to many of you. We've eradicated many of the diseases that people would have had that would have killed them at a younger age. We've also prevented a lot of diseases, so not just sort of cured, but also prevented. But interestingly, one of the best reasons that we've increased our life expectancy is public health. It has very little to do with medical advances and interventions. It's the fact that we go to the bathroom in a toilet. That's what increased our life expectancy. Or we learned how to wash our hands. Can you believe washing our hands added 20 years to our life? I don't know what the number is, but I mean, it's amazing how we sort of didn't pass on communicable diseases because we learned that washing our hands is important. And being in a nursing home and having taken the nursing home administrator's license, I know that it requires 30 seconds by state law to wash your hands. So all of you go home and sing happy birthday to yourself, and that's how you can wash your hands. Yes?
Do you know what year that was? Because wasn't it like it wasn't even believed by the medical community? They had to be convinced. So when did that happen?
It's pretty crazy. You know, I don't know the exact date. Anyone in the room here of, yeah?
I don't know the exact date, but there was when the suffragettes were really active and public health was a big issue, and they were trying to get young women, and you know, there was a movement in making health.
Sure, public health and welfare.
Right, yeah, that it was, and water. I think at that point they were also working on getting sewer systems and water.
Yep. So we're maybe looking at the progressive era, which would be like the late 19-teens. I teach social welfare history as well at the U. It's one of my passions. And you're right, you know, the Maternal Child and Health Act was one of the first acts that brought forth, we just need to wash our hands in 1919. So, but it takes time for your life expectancy to increase. And we didn't increase overnight. So over the last 100 years, we've nearly doubled our life expectancy, which is pretty significant when you think about it. And it's also a good thing. I mean, it's especially a good thing if you really love your parents and your grandparents. They're going to be around longer. If you don't, then, you know, send them to Florida or something. But, you know, this whole idea of not only the aging of the baby boom generation, but the fact that baby boomers are living longer is significantly increasing the number of older people in our community. And the last reason that we, and it's kind of the little bit more difficult one to think about, but it sort of looks at that ratio. Why are there more older people in the community? And it's because people are having less children. My generation was not a big generation for having kids. The end of the boomers and the beginning of Generation X tended to have a few more kids, but sort of when you get to the end of Generation X, people kind of started not having as many kids, and that's why we leveled out and we don't have that continued increase of the number of younger people. So we have fewer children in comparison to the other ages, that leveling out. The other thing when we're looking at the decrease in birth rate is we look at a horrible concept, but an important one to think about. It's called the dependency ratio. I don't even like the name of it, but I wanted to explain it briefly, and I have a little chart on the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio is calculated to look at who in our community is dependent on others, and that dependency could be physically dependent, but more so it looks at financially dependent, and that's why people over the age of 65 often are put in this category because they're receiving Medicare and Social Security regardless of whether they want them or not, because that's how those policies work. You have to take Medicare. You don't have a choice. And so when you look at sort of the youth part of this, and this one's probably really hard to see, but there is a red, and it's supposed to be green. The red color is youth, and the green is older adults. On a side note, this is not my chart, it's the state demographer's chart. When I was studying as an undergrad, I had a nurse as my advisor. She had a double master's in nurse and the psychology of aging. Her name was Laura Schubert, and I loved her immensely. She hated the word elderly. In fact, she said if you ever put it in a paper, you have to cross it out before you turn that paper in or I will fail you. She was 67 years old, so she and she was grading. She had the right to do whatever she wanted. Faculty can be crazy, I know I'm one of them. But she didn't like that word elderly because it thought of dependency. You know, when studies have been asked sort of to talk about what does a senior look like, what does an older adult look like, and what does someone who's elderly look like, the elderly person is always the one that has dementia, is in the wheelchair, is frail, and requires services. And so I try not to use that term. Another little story about Laura, because I just love talking about her. She was just a feisty woman, and sometimes difficult to have, but she told us a story once of, she was a strong feminist too, and she was an operating room nurse, and she said one of the first times she was in the operating room, the doctor turned to her very condescendingly and said, "Now Laura, you see that thing right there? That's called the uvula. It's your job to make sure I don't cut it. And Laura, being this feminist, yeah, I'm not going to take this from a doctor. I have 2 masters. She said, doctor, you see that thing right there? That's called the tongue. I'll make sure you don't cut that either. That was like her classes through my, and that's what shaped me in aging, was this woman who just fearless to go after. So anyway, I digress from the dependency ratio. So if you look at the green, you see the dependency ratio for older people is actually increasing. Why we look at that is because youth generally leave the dependency ratio for a time period. An older adult, once in the dependency ratio, does not leave. This number also does take into account older adults who maintain working in their retirement, so it even takes that into consideration. So that sort of makes us think pretty significantly about what our state is going to look like and our communities are going to look like. So we looked at the demographic trends of individuals. What about households? We can get some good information about households from our census data and other surveys. This comes from the Minnesota State Demographic Center, and it looks at either the increase and decrease in household types in Minnesota. So I want you to look at sort of the largest growth. The largest growth is with married without kids, 55 plus, and living alone, 55 plus. These are individuals that are at risk as they age. They're at risk as they age because they may not have that caregiver, that unpaid caregiver, when I use the term, an unpaid caregiver to help them with services and supports if they may need them. And they'll continue potentially aging alone. And so if you look at actually the married with kids, that's pretty striking. Over the next 10 years, we're actually going to lose households married with kids. That's never happened before either. So not only are individuals sort of aging, but our household composition, what our households look like in Minnesota, is radically changing. And that changes the way we think about policy and how we can support people in their homes. All right, so this is a big table, and this comes from a study that the Wilder Foundation does on poverty, and it has lots of significant numbers that we can look at, and I'm just going to look at a few. While Minnesota is often touted as really having a better quality of life than almost any state, we actually fight often with Hawaii, though I think somehow Vermont jumped in there this year. That was insane. All they do is drink syrup there. It's like, what, 5 people live in Vermont? I mean, come on. They're all healthy. Yay. I mean, we can't compete. We have 6 million people. So when we look at our numbers, we're often touted as sort of being more educated, having a higher income, being healthier. That's not true of all of us, and this table explains that very clearly. When you're looking at the comparison between white, non-Hispanics, and people of color, look at the difference in median household income. $68,000 for whites and $43,000 for all color. Look at how it dips when you break out specific populations of color. African Americans compared to whites have a $40,000 difference in the average of our income. That's significant. Also, take a look at the percent in poverty. We're doing pretty well, 9%. It kind of shifts left and right. I would say 9% is a horrible number for people that are in poverty, and we continue to work on that. If you look at whites in poverty, 6%. African Americans in poverty, 32%. 1 in 3 African Americans in Minnesota live in poverty. That is significant, and we know that poverty greatly impacts health, life expectancy, all kinds of things, education attainment. Also, what's interesting is look at our median age, and this is slowly ticking up every year, our median age. But look at the median age for white, non-Hispanic, and look at the median age of all color. 40 is the median age for whites. It is 14 years lower than all colors. That's a significant difference. That's almost a generation difference in the majority and the minority. So this is a significant change in Minnesota. Did you have a question?
No, you you actually just mentioned it, I was looking at the median age of 40 compared to an age of 27 or 26. You know, there's almost 20 years of work experience of gathered income.
Mm-hmm.
And right now with jobs and incomes being so stressful and not readily at hand, I can't see that this is going to get any better.
It's huge. I'm sure many of you have heard in the news the achievement gap. Has anyone heard of that? They talk a lot about how whites, and compared to their minority counterparts, have a very significant difference in their achievement in school, from grades to graduation rates to all of those indicators. We have disparities not just in education, but we have disparities in health, in socioeconomic status, and poverty. And one of the issues is everyone's getting better. That's good. Even people of color, these numbers, they look like but they're getting better. They're slowly getting better. But in order to close that gap, people of color have to get better faster than the white population is getting, and it's not working out. So the gap is actually, so we're both getting better. So let me start down here. We're both getting better, but unfortunately, if that gap is ever to close, people of color have to get better faster. And we don't have a lot of policies and supports that allow that to happen. So it's huge. I'm a numbers person. I say it's fascinating and interesting, but then I take a step back and think that these are people. These are people that live in our communities, and these are people that are going to be, caring for us. They're going to be the future caregivers. And so how do we equip them so that they're able to provide that service? Let's see if there's anything else about this chart I found interesting while I was looking at it. So I think that's good. Anyone else have any other comments about this? They closed the door so I can no longer see the time. So which is fine because they're making lots of noise back there. We're going to take a break shortly for people to stretch and use the restroom, because it looks like 3 of us are going to have a restroom to ourselves, and the rest of you will all have to wait in line. So that generally happens when I do these types of presentations. So, all right. So many factors really drive policy, which is what I'm going to talk about a little today. The ending is the so what. We've talked about demographics. We're not going to go into politics. I try not to go into politics as little as possible. I'll talk a little bit about it because it is gumming things up a little bit, but I like to talk about policy and let other people deal with politics and all of that fighting. Demographics are one thing we look at. So we've looked at demographics pretty comprehensively, so you all could pass a demographics test if we handed one out. I won't do that, but now we're going to talk a little bit about this economic trend, and this is a table that, again, I'm not a big fan of tables and charts, but it shows a really clear picture here. So this table came from the Minnesota State Economist. Interestingly, so I told you the Minnesota State demographer's name was Tom. The Minnesota State Economist's name was Tom as well, Tom Stinson. And Tom would go out all over Minnesota and do their little roadshow on Minnesota's aging, Minnesota. And then Tom would talk about demographics, and then Tom would talk about economics. They both retired within a year of one another. And now we have 2 women, a state demographer and a state economist. They're both women, so I think that's a plus for Minnesota. Both very young women, actually. And now they're going out and doing their roadshow that we're aging. So this comes from, very young, but this comes from Tom Stinson, and he is at the University of Minnesota. That's where the state economist is located before he retired. So this looks at two different stories. One is an individual, and one is a couple. These are really just round numbers, just to kind of prove a point, right? So if you look sort of at the top here, this would be when the individual is working and when the couple is working in Minnesota. And he takes a look at what their income tax would be, what their sales tax would be, and what their total is. What I'm showing you is very plain language. Government's paycheck. This is what government gets paid in this scenario from this individual or this couple. So that's the money that we use to pay our bills. And in Minnesota, unlike the federal government where we can have a deficit, and you probably hear about all of those talks related to the debt ceiling and the deficit, and we're ticking up, we're continuing to tick up. Minnesota can't do that. As I said, we have to be at 0 every biennium. We cannot be in the red. Our state constitution does not allow us to be in the red. So these are the numbers that we look at when we're creating our budget, right? And we all may create a budget, you know, what we have to pay for our mortgage and our groceries and all that kind of stuff. The state does the same thing. Their budget is somewhere around 6,000 pages, but it's a kind of similar scenario, right? So what happens when this individual or this couple retires? Well, things change to the paycheck, to the government. What happens is very little in income tax. It assumes one continues working. Sales tax go down, and people often question, well, why would sales tax go down? You're still buying stuff. As a worker, people tend to buy a little bit more. You tend to be buying a specific clothing if your job requires it. And for those who work, you may recall the going out to lunches. That's supposed to happen once a month, and it tends to be once a day. You find yourself going out with coworkers. So easy to go get that $5 footlong or whatever. So that kind of adds up in your consumption. But your consumption goes down upon retirement generally. So you look at the total here. Again, it's our paycheck. So now there's something red. I'm sure you all have already looked at it. This is our pay cut. This is the state's pay cut when an individual retires or one person in a couple retires. So when we're doing our budget, instead of this $2,018, we now have a budget of $559 to work with. And instead of this $4,682, we have $1,987 to work with. That's a cut in a paycheck, a pretty significant cut in a paycheck. And these are things that pay for our roads, our highways, they pay for our medical assistance, they pay for parts of Medicare, they pay for our schools, they pay for our defense, they pay for our national parks. Well, this would be state parks, so if I'm using a state example, it wouldn't be paying for Medicare, it would be paying for medical assistance. So you could see kind of what's happening and why we've had these deficits, and long-term planning, which the state legislature and state government is pretty darn bad at, is so important, because we're going to continue to experience cuts in our paycheck. At the same time, people are going to be using more services. More people are going to be enrolling in Medicare and are going to be eligible for Social Security. We have to pay more with less. That's the problem that's happening right now. And why people are having, I almost said a very hot button word, are having very passionate discussions about Social Security and Medicare. Even though this has nothing to do with Social Security and Medicare, because they're paid completely different. This is general fund. But that's why people are having those conversations, because we're having less money and more payouts. It's one of the kind of downsides of an aging population. So the word that you may have heard is Medicare and Social Security solvency. And what tends to happen is Medicare and Social Security right now are solvent. They're considered solvent. Parts of Medicare are solvent. Parts of Social Security are solvent. What happens is they look at the trust fund that we all pay into, right? Part of our paycheck goes to fund Medicare Part A and Social Security retirement and disability insurance. Those parts are solvent. The other parts aren't so much solvent. And we kind of have to have discussions about priorities. Do we want to pay for those things that aren't solvent? And that's where people tend to disagree. All right, I have one more slide, and then we're going to take a little bit of break to get more cookies, and if they didn't take them all, or refreshments and stuff, we'll figure out all that stuff. So not only when we look at sort of policies do we look at money coming in, but where is all of our money going? What are we spending money on as a state? The state's really good at this. The Department of Human Services really likes to see what they're buying. And since they typically are the largest single purchaser of services, they like to really advocate for people that they're buying a high-quality product. When you look at the cost of providing home health care paid for by the government, or a nursing home paid for by the government, we have some pretty significant differences. So when you look at home health care, general reimbursement for that is $31,200 for 200 visits. So maybe about once a day. Nursing home care is, the average for Minnesota is $73,913 for 1 year. So when the state looks at, well, what should we pay for home health care, we could pay for 400 visits of home health care and still be cheaper than a nursing home. So how do we sort of fix this? And it's one great thing that you're doing is providing those alternative services to delay or prevent institutionalization that the state loves. They love paying for that kind of stuff. So you're kind of really on the side, you're with the trend that the state has in rebalancing long-term care. That's the term they use. They're trying to take the money from nursing homes, sort of shift it into the home and community-based services. So they're actually paying more for things like chore services, transportation, home health care, companion services, laundry, meal preparation, rather than paying for skilled nursing care. So people often wonder, well, isn't this paid for? You know, don't we pay for this, you know, ourselves? Isn't that a, you know, I have Medicare, so Medicare will cover this. And that's where I'm going to pause and leave you wondering, how would I pay for that? And think about that. Don't go too depressed during your break. But if you had to move into a nursing home, say, tonight, we're not going to drive home, we're going to stay, how would you pay that $73,000 for 1 year of nursing home? So, and we'll talk about that when everyone comes back. So like 10, 50, whatever, as people start coming back, the restrooms are straight down